What was your best you have no power here moment? My mother-in-law passed away last year and my wife, and I got rid of the leftover stuff. Most was easy, except the AT router for her internet access. We got a total runaround point. I brought it into an AT store, the same one my mill had signed up from, and they said it had to be returned in some special box from the local post office. We went to the post office, and were told the special box came from AT. We went back to AT, in a different city, and were told yet another BS story. It caused my wife an amazing amount of grief. Her mother had just died. She's trying to do the adult thing and responsibly close out her mother's accounts. And that was just being a bunch of ass clowns. The router became her albatross. The router sat in the trunk of the car for weeks. One day I'm grabbing lunch and notice another AT. I walk inside and up to a desk where a rep is talking internet plans with another customer. I don't interrupt, but the rep pauses to give me a story about how I can't return the router here and will need to set up a return with a central office point. I calmly put the router on her desk and said no, I won't be doing that. The owner of this account just died. I'm just trying to give you your property back. You've given me the runaround for weeks now and I'm done. As I turn to walk away she yells, but we are just going to throw it away. If you leave it here, you'll get charged for it. Okay, bye me. I toss over my shoulder as I walk out the door. Good luck collecting from a dead woman. I occasionally wonder if the other customer stuck around or not. But then I remember who runs the FCC, and it's not like there's a real choice in ISPs in most areas of the country. I thought I didn't have an answer for this question, but you reminded me of the time this happened with my ex-mill. A dog had wandered into my ears on a brutally bitter winter evening. She was very obviously someone's pet. Clean, new commands, wearing a tag, FFS, but what do I know, right? Anyway, I call the number, but it's to a system of sorts, I guess to protect your personal info. You call them, they call the owner calls you, and they're closed for the evening, so I decide I'll take the dog in overnight and call again in the morning. We had a male dog of our own and a toddler, and while the dog seemed sweet enough, and the dogs seemed okay with each other, I thought it would be best to dig out our dog's old crate and keep her in the spare room while we slept. There would be no fights or baby macking on my watch. Meanwhile, Mill stops by, and I tell her the story. She tells me in no uncertain terms that I will not be keeping that dog in the house with her baby, at which point I pointed out that I paid the mortgage, that baby was my daughter, and I called the shots here. She called my husband to cry about how terribly I treated her, and he politely told her to go fuck herself. And it ended up taking 2 days to return the dog. She was a perfect house guest the entire time, and the owner brought a bone for our dog as a thank you for keeping her dog safe. TLDR, credit union tried to bill my father's estate for a card they wouldn't provide documentation for. I told them in detail why that wasn't going to happen. After my father passed away, there was a small amount of estate related issues to take care of. I was the legal executor of his estate. While I was sorting through things, I started getting letters from a local credit union regarding a credit card account of his that they wanted paid off. Problem was, I could find no evidence on my end, in all of Dad's paperwork, of his having had that credit card. And though I knew he had a savings account with them, I didn't recall any prior bills from them regarding said credit card, and I'd been handling his bills for close to a year before he passed away. I went in to ask for evidence and got told that only the CEO could handle the matter. She was on vacation that week, so I left my name and number to have her get back to me. When she finally called me back, she didn't offer evidence, but instead offered a number of demands that I immediately pay the money and that if there wasn't enough money in Dad's estate I should sell the house he had owned for an alleged debt of about $600. Pointing out that he had not, in fact, owned said house for quite some time. By the time he died fell on deaf ears. The letters continued, some personally written and rather harassing in tone. I was feeling rather concerned, as I didn't know exactly what they could do or what my options were. I know the smart thing would have been to retain an estate lawyer to handle it, but what do you do when you're not an attorney and don't have the money to retain one? I had been handling things myself as the most financially minded of my siblings, and trying to handle things as a matter of common sense and common decency. There weren't a lot of assets or debts with the estate. It seemed like it should be pretty straightforward, and other than this one case, all of it went smoothly. Fortunately, Oregon's estate laws are actually really easy to read for a layperson. I spent several nights studying the various sections and determined exactly how things should go, and wrote a letter, sent certified delivery with a return receipt, back to the credit union CEO. In the letter I stated the following. First, that as there was no evidence presented for the claim, I was formally denying it in my capacity as executor, which the law allowed, with a window of opportunity of 30 days, to appeal the design decision in court. Second, that if she wished to make an appeal to me personally and save on the court fees, she needed to provide documentation of the account, including a record of all transactions and charges, to justify the amount claimed. Naturally, I got a letter back 4 weeks later. It contained some paperwork, including the paperwork establishing Dad's savings account, but nothing establishing a credit card. Further, the letter stated that it would be too onerous to provide full records of all the transactions. Any bankers out there, take note, never tell a programmer it's too difficult for you to access your own data. We know it's either bullshit or that you're admitting incompetence. This would have been a 5-minute database query for me, and that's if I had to look up the tables first. It reiterated the demand for immediate payment, again stating the house, again, not actually Dad's, but she kept insisting it was, needed to be sold to pay for it. I wrote another letter. In this letter I clarified several points for her. First, that as she had not provided the required documentation, she had not actually made an appeal that would be subject to evaluation, let alone acceptance. Therefore, the original denial of the claim stood unchanged. Second, that it was not her place to determine my father's assets, as she was not executor of the estate. Third, that even if her claim had been granted, Oregon law requires 6 months from the decedent's passing to receive all claims before any of those claims may be paid out, and by demanding immediate payment she was attempting to get me to break the law. Fourth, that Oregon law declares the priority of claims by the nature of them, and credit card debts were ANCN, that is, everything not covered above, where the above included taxes, medical debts, and various other things. Even if her claim had been granted, she could not be paid unless there was money left after paying all higher priority debts, and even if the house had been included that wouldn't have been the case. And fifth, as the 1-month deadline for appealing in court would expire by the time they received this letter, they had exhausted all of their legal options, and further attempts to pursue the claim would constitute unlawful harassment, and charges would be pressed in such an instance. I didn't hear back from them again. I guess probably yesterday. I went to Mickey D's for some dinner and the lady served the guy in front of me first, then started to work on my McFlurry. She was about to put in the MMS when the first guy came back, complaining that they usually added more ice cream than that. For the record, he's talking about an inch of ice cream. For anyone unfamiliar with the ice cream going in a cup process of McDonald's, they put the ice cream in first, then put the lid on, then put the toppings in, then swirl it. Dude was mad because the ice cream wasn't going all the way to the top of the lid after being swirled. Before the argument could really get started, I interrupted them and asked her if she could please finish up my McFlurry before dealing his greedy ass. I remember she said sure, turned to the machine, then turned back to me with an incredulous look on her face and said thank you. Then the dude thanked me too. I quickly informed him not to thank me because I was 100% not on his side at all, and that I thought he was ridiculous for arguing over an inch of ice cream. At this point, she's put the toppings in, and he really said, let's do an analysis here, and started comparing how my McFlurry looked like it had more ice cream in it than his, because it reached halfway up the lid. It's at this point that she pointed out she had yet to swirl it. Lo and behold, once she swirled it, our ice cream looked nearly identical. At this point the manager came over, wondering why this dude had raised his voice. I explained he was mad because he didn't receive an extra inch of ice cream, and got mad that swirling seemingly makes the ice cream magically disappear, and the manager laughed in the guy's face. I guess probably yesterday. I went to Mickey D's for some dinner and the lady served the guy in front of me first, then started to work on my McFlurry. She was about to put in the MMS when the first guy came back, complaining that they usually added more ice cream than that. For the record, he's talking about an inch of ice cream. For anyone unfamiliar with the ice cream going in a cup process of McDonald's, they put the ice cream in first, then put the lid on, then put the toppings in, then swirl it. Dude was mad because the ice cream wasn't going all the way to the top of the lid after being swirled. Before the argument could really get started, I interrupted them and asked her if she could please finish up my McFlurry before dealing his greedy ass. I remember she said sure, turned to the machine, then turned back to me with an incredulous look on her face and said thank you. Then the dude thanked me too. I quickly informed him not to thank me because I was 100% not on his side at all, and that I thought he was ridiculous for arguing over an inch of ice cream. At this point, she's put the toppings in, and he really said, let's do an analysis here, and started comparing how my McFlurry looked like it had more ice cream in it than his, because it reached halfway up the lid. It's at this point that she pointed out she had yet to swirl it. Lo and behold, once she swirled it, our ice cream looked nearly identical. At this point the manager came over, wondering why this dude had raised his voice. I explained he was mad because he didn't receive an extra inch of ice cream, and got mad that swirling seemingly makes the ice cream magically disappear, and the manager laughed in the guy's face. I worked for a school board and they contracted me to do some additional work on the side creating a website. When it was complete I went to the guy for presentation and payment, and he told me he wouldn't be paying me, and there was nothing I could do. I leaned over and deleted the site. He seemed curiously surprised somehow. I giggled. He later wanted the website restored, and he would pay me with stolen school merchandise. I told him I wasn't going to steal from children and teachers, just so he could have leverage over me. Another time I had made a website allowing people to send messages to the members of the school board. He later wanted me to send him the messages so he could vet them. I added him to the CC of every message. I was then asked in a board meeting why he was also getting these messages, and I told them why he felt entitled to their private communications. They talked to him. When I put in my notice there, he came to my cubicle on a busy floor and told me I'd have to pay them back for training they sent me to. He said it so quietly too. So I asked him if he was threatening me, but I said it loudly so everyone came to see what was up. He literally fled. What a faking tool. Oh fuck, I'm late to this, and this is one of the best situations. I had a boss in a job I worked at for 11 years. He was a total sheethead, ran the place like it was a prison camp, and wrote people up for nothing. He was a senior manager and pretty high up our corporate ladder, and I was a laborer doing labor work. I was actually on a temp contract and was given F/T by another manager, and this guy told me if it were my decision, I would have just let the contract run out. Anyways, years went by and I gradually moved up the ladder. Around year 8 he was let go in order to change it up a bit, and that was the last I saw of him. I eventually moved on and into a management role at a new company, reporting to just a single senior manager and then the president. My manager was promoted to a director role in another area and the job became vacant. Guess who faking applied? He searched the place out on LinkedIn and found I was there, and he name dropped me in his interview. He sent me a message saying he'd appreciate it if I put in a good word for him. Yay. Well, I wasn't going to work for Hitler twice, so I told him politely, I'm sorry, but I don't feel your leadership style is suited for this work environment. I then told ours the same thing and some of the stories of the past. He didn't get hired. Fuck that guy. I worked this job. My org structure was completely faked. I worked for the regional executive VP of TechSheet directly. He'd been my boss, and then he'd been promoted 5, and they hadn't hired anyone. So in a healthy company, he'd have been 5 layers of management above me, but in our company, he was my boss. This is a simplification. He was hired 3 levels over me, VP, and then got the 4th level, state VP, when they fired his counterpart, so he only got bumped once, to regional VP. His boss was the CTO of the whole corporation. and his boss was the C. At about this time, they spun off the tech side into its own business unit, with the CTO as the effective CEO. So, if you had a problem with the tech guy, you talked to his manager. Now, remember, my manager is one step below the CTO. I was in a bad spot. I had a lot of work to do, but no team anymore to help me. All the various teams I was on had once been a really big group, but now it was just a handful. Maybe 10 guys left out of 150. Still the same amount of work. Or at least, other groups thought so. People would assign me things, and then the various managers of those people would call me and tell me to make that my top priority point, and I would laugh in their faces and tell them to call my boss now. They couldn't call my boss. He didn't work for the same company. They had to call their boss, who would call their boss, etc. until it got to the CEO, and then he would tell the CTO to tell my boss, to tell me to do something. You can guess how many times that happened. If I pissed someone off enough, my boss would call me, and he would say, please, do not talk to that person ever again. People would bluster at me, and I would laugh the laugh of a guy who had the workload of 15 people, and they would get outraged and demand to talk to my boss, and I would laugh even harder and then give them the number of his secretary, knowing that they would never talk to him, and it wasn't my problem. The only beauty of that job was watching people who thought they had power realize that they had nothing. They weren't even allowed to talk to my boss. He was so high up. They had to escalate their shit to their boss, and so on. And their boss's boss almost always told them to STFU and get back to work. Nothing ever came into my work queue from someone who was remotely at my level, and the but that was incredible. It was glorious. I worked for a company that had one of those video game buses with the TVs and couches and shit on the inside. I was the only employee and was technically the event manager and supervisor. That was just a fancy term for me being the only one to drive the truck and set it up and do maintenance on it and shit. All my boss did was schedule bookings and tell me where I was going. I processed the payments as well, so I was basically in charge of the entire operation. This woman came into the trailer at the end of a party to bitch at me since her kid didn't have enough fun. I told her all the other kids were having a great time and nobody else complained. She insisted I give her a full refund since her kid didn't enjoy himself, and I told her I wasn't going to do that. She asked who my manager was, and I told her I was the manager. She then asked who my employer was, and I told her his name. She demanded I call him so she could talk to him, and on speakerphone, my boss said I wasn't there to see how things were going. It's up nudes for compliment to determine whether a refund is called for or not. Side note, while he was technically my boss, it was more like two friends running a business. He's a few years older than me and hired me off the street, but we were both in our 20s at the time. He just turned 30 like 6 months ago, and his dad paid for everything for him. Very wealthy family, so he wasn't really concerned about sucking the customer's dick. I ended up telling her I wasn't going to refund the entire $350 because one kid didn't have a good time and promptly left. What's funny is a bunch of the parents at the event apparently got raving reviews from their kids, and that party actually brought in like 8 new customers, a few of which booked us multiple times a year. She apparently tried talking bad about the company to the other parents, but that didn't seem to stop them, since everyone else had a great time. I miss that job. Best job I ever had. In my second job in a restaurant, I was hired as a dishwasher in a recent opened trattoria. I worked my ass up to the kitchen. A year later I was the chief pizzaiolo. 3 years later I was the only open crew still working. The owner and I became friends. I was good doing my job and taking care of almost every issue in the kitchen as well. 5 years later the owner wife decides she wanted to work there as a supervisor / do as I like. She treated people badly, screaming and calling names. Some good coworkers left because of her, leaving me with more work and the need of training people almost every week. I went to the owner, told him I wanted to quit because of that situation. He said wait a secretary. We were in the management office. He came back with his wife. I toughed that I was gonna get fired. He looked at her and said if you go near the pizzeria, he, pointing at me, is the boss there, so not mess with the guys there. He reports to me she tried to say something, and he interrupted her with, "You know why I pay this faker so well? Is because he gets shit done, and I don't have to worry about the pizzeria almost never." I said thanks and walked out. They got in some argument, but they were used to it. She tried to get me fired for almost a year after that incident, then we ended being in a weird friendship. In my senior year of high school, I was really into foreign languages and decided to take Spanish I with all the freshmen in addition to my app German class. I spent a couple weeks in the new Spanish class when our counseling office decided they made a mistake and needed to put half of us in a Spanish class during a different period. This messed with the lunch hour I shared with my boyfriend. I went to the counselor and asked if I could stay in the original Spanish class because I wanted to keep my lunch hour the same as my boyfriend. Understandably, she thought that was a pretty silly reason and said no. Since the Spanish class was a whim for me anyway, I said fine, I'll drop Spanish and take a different elective then. She got all huffy and threatened to call my mom to tell her I was dropping an academic course just to hang out with my boyfriend. I told her to go ahead, and she did. My mom was like, my daughter gets straight A's and was taking a second language for fun. She can do whatever she wants with her class schedule. The counselor hung up and magically found a way to keep me in my original Spanish class. If it makes the story any better, I'm married to the same boyfriend. I was 18, in college, and started working at a new food eatery in their drive-thru. I had a blast. My roomie worked there, my friends worked there, and all was good. Until one payday. I went in with roomie to get our check. Mine wasn't there. I initially panicked because I knew I'd worked extra hours and needed it to pay bills. The manager then said my check was downstairs with the owner, an old, grotty, fat Greek guy. I almost threw up right then as I couldn't stand this old faker, so I go downstairs and there is the troll. I took my check from him, but paused to make sure all was correct. In the envelope, all correct except there was a stack of cash totaling $1,500. I asked him what it was for, but he suddenly grabbed me by the throat and shoved me onto this table. He forcefully spread my legs and started to try to pull my jeans down. Scared shirtless, I tried to scream, but he put his hand over my mouth. Totally panicked, I brought both of my knees up and kicked him full force in the chest, causing him to fall backwards. I ripped the tape off my mouth and said, "You planning on rapping me? Well, fuck you." I took my envelope, went upstairs and called the police loudly at their counter. Before leaving that day, I submitted my resignation saying I didn't want to be rapped by the owner. I was the one in power. This guy used to come into the movie theater I worked at every Monday night. Apparently he had worked there before, but I had been there for like 6 years at this point, and I had never worked with him. Anyway, every time he would come in, he would come late to the very last movie and then expect us to pop fresh popcorn and put new hot dogs on the clean grill. We would save the last batch of popcorn in a plastic bag and keep the hot dogs in a steam drawer, so it's not like we didn't have what he wanted. He just wanted special treatment. Then he would try to pull that scam where he gives the cashier a $100 bill and then add stuff to his order and takes stuff away to confuse the cashier and get free stuff. He was always super rude. When I got promoted to management, I was finally able to stand up to him a little. I said something like, "You come in here every Monday, talk down to my cashier, and try to scam us out of money. I'm not going to put up with it anymore." Dude flipped out. Started saying how he used to work here, so he knows how everything works, okay, and how he's on the city council of a different city in a different county. I'm pretty sure I just laughed and said, "You're in my city, so that doesn't matter." He was pissed, but he actually started being less rude and stopped trying to scam us altogether. Eventually he stopped coming. I don't even know why he came to my theater, since his city has like 2 to 3 to choose from, one being the same chain that mine was. Fuck you, Griffin. I was working a show where the stagehunds had to walk on stage in costume to hook up some of our performers during a scene for a flight. This had to be done by a technician due to the life safety involved, and our agreement. We all grumbled about wearing the stupid costume, but it was provided for us, and it's in our contract that we can wear whatever they want us to, as long as they provide it. Somewhere along final dress, the director notices that some of the techs are female. She requests to make all stagehands that do that track male and is unceremoniously told by our steward that no, she can't do that. It is in fact against the law and discriminatory because we are not hired for our look like the actors are. But by skill point she then started requesting the women style their hair a certain way, remove glasses and jewelry, and do their makeup. At this point the steward met up with the production manager with a note from our lawyer again reminding everyone that technicians are not actors, and she gets no choice if she wants to keep the effect. The director was summarily told to shut the hell up in a closed door meeting and never bothered us again, though I can guarantee it still bothers her to this day. Two different moments, both relating to my mother. The first was when I was 19 and we were driving to the college campus for registration. It was stressful, she was bent out of shape and being even more controlling than usual. I said something she didn't like, either said screw you or called her a bitch. She slapped me across the face. I kind of blinked and then I realized that I was over 18 and no longer legally obligated to quietly take being slapped around. I told her that the next time she hit me, I'd hit her back and that I was stronger than she was. That was the last time she raised a hand to me, and I'm not sorry at all. The next was several years later. I had finally gotten my act together, rented an apartment, and was moving out. I was moving the last load of stuff from their place to my apartment, and she was standing in the apartment parking lot. She asked for the house key back, and I handed it over. I was no longer living here, and her house, her rules, whatever. She then told me that I was not to give a key to my apartment to my then boyfriend. I just smiled and nodded because there was no point in having an argument about it. I'm now very happily married to the boyfriend that she so despised. Literally, she told me that she never wanted to see him again and that if that meant she'd never see me again, she was fine with it, and I have no contact with her. In grade 10, our phys edition class was doing its annual health program, basically the annual abstinence is best talk, and were assigned to a random classroom for the period. Someone from the previous period had left a container of unopened yogurt on a desk, which a bunch of kids decided would be fun to throw around. It landed on the floor at my feet, but didn't explode, thankfully, at which point I grabbed it, tossed it in the trash, and told the kids to grow the fuck up. At this precise moment, the teacher walks in. She lights into me and says something to the effect of "Didn't your mother ever tell you how bad it is to swear?" and tells me she plans to call my mother after school for swearing, which I shrug off. I got home after school, told my mother what happened and to expect a call. About 45 minutes later, she gets said call and my mother listens patiently, then, in her best mom voice, says, "Well, that's not quite the story my daughter shared when she got home," and asks if she recalls questioning my mother's parenting, and proceeds to tell the teacher my side of the story, and asked if the teacher had bothered to call the other children's parents for their lack of public etiquette. She had not. She hadn't bothered to ask what I had been cursing about in the first place. My mother ended the call by suggesting that the teacher gets the full story next time, before calling to question her parenting skills. Had I not been such a weirdly honest teen who routinely confessed to skipping class, failing a test, always math, not doing homework, or where I would be, and what I would be doing, my mother might have had a different reaction, but had no good reason to think I was lying, and basically got told to save the cursing for at home. I didn't, just got better at minding myself around faculty. I got into an argument with a coworker while waiting at a train station about my lack of religious beliefs. She actually interfered in my conversation with someone else and ended up becoming offended by it. We rode the same bus train to work every day because we also lived in the same apartments. Well, later that same week, I got promoted to supervisor, and guess who is on my team? That's right. The coworker who hates me. She was the worst employee I ever had, but I tried to work with her. Eventually, I had to write her up for call avoidance. But she went to ours and told them that I was being unfair to her and cited her religion as the reason why. She told ours about the conversation we had, but neglected to tell them that it didn't happen on company grounds. hours and my boss comes to me to talk about where I set them straight, but since religion was involved it was decided to not ruffle any feathers, so she got off. Knowing that she had it in for me, I decided to only communicate with her through my team lead. And once again, she was avoiding calls, so I wrote her up again. This time, I allowed time to pass and tracked all of her time and got so much data that ours couldn't ignore it. Once again, she tried to cry foul and claim religious harassment. But little did she know, I had my team lead and my boss watching her as well. This time, she had no recourse and ours agreed to allow me to fire her. That was the best feeling in the world. No one will read this. Here goes. I worked at a residential psychiatric facility. A kid had cut herself up pretty badly and was trying to use the blood as a weapon. Because she was there as part of her probation, we had to call the police. While we were waiting for the police to arrive, she was trying to cut herself up even more with shards from the mirror. I had to restrain her, and during the struggle, she passed out. The police arrived and found me on the floor with her head in my lap. There was a lot of blood. She was clearly passed out. One of the officers looked me straight in the eyes and said that if she got aggressive again they would step in. Without dropping his stare, I asked him what he thought that would look like. The subtext was me challenging his authority, which I was. He told me that they would do what was necessary and put her in cuffs. I looked down at the girl in my lap. She wasn't more than 100 pounds. The only real damage she had done was to herself. She had been begging for us to let her die and only used blood to keep us away from her. I returned his stare and told him there was no way two men she didn't know were going to put their hands on this young girl. She had been violently raped by men and abused most of her life. Incredulous, he asked if I wanted them here at all. No, I don't see the necessity of you being here. She's not a threat and we called you only because we were required to do so. They left. Or that's what I thought. Once the kid came around and we got her cleaned up, my supervisor came in and told me that the cops wanted to talk with me. They want to arrest you. You're going to have to act really sorry. I did. I lied my ass off and acted really sorry because it wasn't about me. It was about that kid and not allowing her to be further traumatized. So I licked his boots like a man. Because fuck that guy. I played keys for a dude who was on American Idol and wanted to do his own live shows a few years ago. This guy was absurdly rich family and big local names funding album work and live equipment. Lived in a $500,000 apartment. But of course, he couldn't afford to pay the guys even a little who were making his live shows possible. Literally $0 point. Over half a year goes by and we've spent more money being in this group than we've made from driving everywhere. And he's buying all this new crazy stuff with money from his parents and investors. I know playing live shows can take time to build and become lucrative, so I wanted to broach the money topic with care. I raised my concerns that I'm gonna invest another year in this and not see a dime, and he gave me some sass about how I'm not seeing the bigger picture and be more dedicated. He said maybe you aren't the right fit, more as a threat, and I said you know you're right and walked. Point. The rest of the guys in the band bailed too after I did because he's one of the few narcissists I've met. Lots of other things besides money. Since then I haven't seen any posts about gigs he's playing. Wonder why.